For those requesting Bikol myths, this is probably one of the most central myths in Bikol mythology. The myth about how Asuang steals fire from Gugurang. It's kinda long, so I might do this in two parts, and involves the good god and the bad god of Bikol mythology. So according to the myth, long ago when the world was still young, good and evil gods were not yet enemies. They were friends, and they each lived in a separate mountain. One even says that they were brothers. Gugurang, the good god, lived in Mount Mayon, and Asuang, the evil, inside Mount Malinaw. So the gods had control over the welfare of people, but Gugurang was the more powerful god, and Asuang was just his subordinate, because Gugurang was chief among the Bikol deities. Gugurang had full control over the people, including their protection and their advancement. And whenever people disobeyed him, he would cause Mount Mayon to rumble, as a warning. Worst case is if their sins were too bad, Gugurang would make the volcano erupt and it would wipe out the sinners. So Gugurang became the symbol of good that punishes evil. When people saw that fire would come out of Mount Mayon, they would grow afraid and think that maybe they disobeyed Gugurang in a certain way, so they would make sacrifices to appease his wrath. So this was the power of Gugurang, the power of fire. Now Asuang had no fire because this was just Gugurang's power, and he became envious of Gugurang. He too wanted to use fire to subdue people. So he went to Gugurang and asked him for fire, in which Gugurang refused. And Gugurang got angry. "How dare you ask me for my fire? Don't you know that when the fire in my seat is carried by hands such as yours, the whole world will be set on fire?" Asuang said, "But I will be very careful." And Gugurang said, "Be careful, I myself with all my power cannot handle it." And Asuang said, "But how can you threaten the people with it?" And Gugurang said, "It is not my will that does it. It is someone else's that you or I do not know, nor will ever know." This is interesting for me because that means that there's some higher power, higher fate over the gods. But anyway, so Asuang said, "But the rainy days are coming and I need fire to make me warm in Mount Malinaw." But Gugurang saw through this and said, "Why, you have lived there for many years and this is the first time that you've asked me for it. What will you use the fire for? Look, your people can live without it." I'm out of time, so I'll continue this tomorrow. Part 2 of the myth, Asuang steals fire from Gugurang. You can watch part 1 in the comment up here. So last we left Asuang and Gugurang. Asuang was trying to get the fire of Gugurang, and he told Gugurang that he needed the fire to keep him warm. But Gugurang said, "You have lived there for many years, and this is the first time that you have asked me for it. What will you use the fire for? Look at your people, they can live without it." And Asuang, trying to trick Gugurang, finally just says, "Well, it is time for you to give them fire now." And Gugurang gets angry at this. He says, "Give them fire," and the earth shook and the people were afraid. Asuang himself became frightened because he had never seen Gugurang like this. And Gugurang says of people, "They are not fit to have it yet. They must make themselves worthy." But Asuang, another god, also asked, "Well, am I not worthy?" To this, Gugurang says, You lazy god, look at your ragged mountain and compare it to Mount Mayon, which is the most beautiful in the world." So they fought for a long time, but Gugurang would not give him the fire. And this is where Asuang finally realized that Gugurang was all-powerful, being chief of the gods. And if you remember in part 1, at this point, the good and evil spirits were friends. But this is where Asuang narrowed his eyes and smiled with sinister import. He decided to oppose him from now on. And this is how the good and evil spirits became enemies. Asuang blames Gugurang. He says, "You want to be the omnipotent power, but between us two, there is not much difference. Why must I live in a humble place like Mount Malinaw while you sit here gloating over your power unlimited and unchecked?" Gugurang said, "Stop," and stamped his feet. But at this, Asuang smiled instead of being afraid, which made Gugurang very angry. Gugurang attempted to hit Asuang, but at this, Asuang vanished. And Gugurang was amazed because apparently this was a new power that Asuang had, turning himself invisible that no one knew about. And the voice of Asuang said, "If I cannot get fire in goodwill, I will in bad. I will steal it." And Gugurang threatened, "Try, and before you can do that, I will cut your mountain in twain." And Asuang replied, "Let there be war between us." Thus, good and evil became enemies. I'll stop here because I'm almost out of time, but what do you think? Who was in the right? Should Gugurang have given or lent his fire to Asuang? Was he too angry? Could this conflict between good and evil have been avoided if both Gugurang and Asuang were more level-headed? Part 3 in the next video. Part 3 of the Bikol Myth of Asuang steals fire from Gugurang. In the last part, Asuang had declared that he was going to steal the fire of Gugurang. And Asuang had said that, "Let there be war between us," and thus good and evil became enemies from then on. So Asuang wanted also to steal the fire because he was ambitious and he was intrigued by the power to rule using fire. So he determined to oppose every move of Gugurang. He gathered around him evil counselors and evil spirits whom he sent to the earth to turn the people to evil ways. So because of Asuang's activities, there was a lot of immorality, lawlessness, and crime. And Gugurang discovered that it was Asuang which was the cause of all of these problems. So Gugurang sent sickness and pestilence to the barrios, and for a moment the people turned to the omnipotent for protection. They turned to Gugurang, which in a modern lens is not the greatest of activities to do. But remember that Gugurang was known, as said in part 1, Gugurang was known as a punisher of evils. So if the people were doing evil things because of Asuang, that's kind of his go-to move. So Gugurang asked people for more sacrifices and warned them to follow his commandments strictly or be exterminated by floods or eruption. And for some reason, Gugurang could not do anything to Asuang directly. He was powerless to actually do anything about Asuang because Asuang suddenly had these hidden powers such as turning invisible. So all Gugurang could do was guard the fire. So he assigned his trusted helpers to guard the fire. Gugurang had become afraid because he felt that if the fire were to go out, then the world would be consumed by it. But even so, Asuang was still able to find the fire. He bribed the guards with gold, and he actually got it. He put it inside a coconut shell. At this point, Gugurang noticed that everything around him started to turn black. And outside, the world was on fire, so he was right. With the fire out, everything started to burn. Every barrio that Asuang passed caught fire. So Gugurang shouted Asuang and pursued him. And again, I'm out of time, so more in the next part. So part 4 in Asuang steals the fire from Gugurang. So at this point, Asuang had stolen the fire, kept it into a coconut shell, and was making his escape from Mount Mayon. But because he had brought the fire out of Mount Mayon, the whole world started to burn. And Gugurang, having figured out what had happened, was now in pursuit of Asuang. So all around, everything was burning, and all the people were in terror. And while this was happening, Gugurang was in the hot pursuit of Asuang. The fire was very important to Gugurang because it was the seat of his power, and without it, he would be powerless. So Asuang was making his way back to his domain of Mount Malinao. And if Asuang had reached Mount Malinao with the fire, then he would have control over Gugurang. I'm not sure exactly why, but that's what it says. And just as Asuang made his last stride into Mount Malinao, Gugurang caught up with him and snatched the fire from the coconut shell. And then Gugurang simply vanished. And this greatly surprised Asuang, for it seemed that Gugurang had his own special powers that no one knew about. And now Asuang tried to make himself invisible, but as much as he tried to use that power, he could not. So Gugurang returned to Mount Mayon and returned the fire to its place, and Mount Mayon became bright again. Next, he had to undo the damage, and so he left Mount Mayon to stop all the fires. He bade the heavens, kalangitan, to rain continuously, and so it rained, and the big fire was quenched. And funnily enough, the people started to offer sacrifices because all the time they had thought it was Gugurang who had brought the fire as a punishment for their wickedness, not knowing that it was this whole escapade with Asuang. Gugurang then punished the guards by chaining them to the precipices for, being bribed and allowing Asuang to get the fire. And now it was his time, Gugurang's time, to get revenge on Asuang. And I'll do this in the last part. Hi, thank you for this. So, try ko ngayon na sabihan mo na lang kung tama pa or may ayusin pa. Gugurang. Tama na ba yan? So, hindi Gugurang. Gugurang. May other videos ako to continue that yung myth ni Gugurang tsaka ni Asuang. So, paki-excuse na lang yung maling pronunciation ng Gugurang doon kasi naka-pre-record na yon tapos pinapost ko lang. Part 5 is probably the last video about the myth Asuang steals fire from Gugurang. So, Gugurang had successfully recovered the fire back from Asuang, and now it was his time for revenge against Asuang. And so, Gugurang called upon lightning, linti, and thunder, dalugdog, to strike against Mount Malinao, which was the domain of Asuang. And Asuang tried to bribe Linti and Dalugdog. And remember, he was able to bribe the guards of fire in Mount Mayon. So I don't know, maybe he thought he'd be lucky twice. And so Asuang told him, "What is the use of your serving a master when you don't even receive any reward? Why don't you join me? Here you can have what you want. You can be your master." And Linti said, "You mean what you said?" And Asuang said, "Sure." And Thunder said, "Well, it is true that Gugurang drives us like slaves." But apparently Gugurang had his own thunderbolt because when he heard this, he sent it and it boom, crash. I don't know what exactly it hit, but for several minutes, the whole world sank and bobbed and sank again due to the power of Gugurang's thunderbolt. Or maybe this was Linti and Dalugdog. Maybe they finally listened because it says, Gugurang then ordered the lightning and the thunder to stop. And so all was over in a few minutes. So then they saw that Mount Malinao was just half of what it used to be. So I guess a thunderbolt hit Mount Malinao. And the people thanked the Omnipotent, thanked Gugurang for destroying the abode of the devil. And so this is also a origin legend as to why Mount Malinao seems to have been cut while Mayon stands majestically unimpaired. And for a time, people thought that Asuang was killed, but later his influence was still doing havoc with the populace, so I guess maybe he could be still alive. So the question is, how did humanity get fire if Gugurang returned it to Mount Mayon? Well, because the whole world was on fire when Asuang stole it, some people were able to keep some of the embers from that whole world fire cataclysm. And so with that, they kept themselves warm and during the rain, and that is also how man got fire. For more videos on pre-colonial and indigenous Philippine culture, folklore, and mythology, subscribe to my YouTube channel and look for me on TikTok.